Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112 Section 2. This happens to be for our class for Thursday, the 14th of October, where I wanted to transition us out of short story and begin talking a little bit about drama. And this is also the point of the semester where you're beginning to do some writing on short story. So for those of you who've already submitted in your journals, thank you. And basically what I'm going to be doing is reviewing those journals, as I indicated, grading them informally on a checkmark system, and then returning them back to you with some of my comments. You can think of it as a kind of dialogue on paper. And hopefully the journals might help you conceptualize some ideas for how you could proceed with our formal writing assignment on short story, which happens to be the academic paper, the critical paper, which is not going to be due until the ending of October. Paper number 1 will be due October 26th, which is a Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. via PDF, much like you submitted in your journals, to my email, because that works best with my grading program, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And hopefully the journals might give you some ideas and some ways to proceed. Not that the journals have to in any way be connected with your paper. So we had talked about the paper should be approximately 4 to 5 pages where you are examining one idea or element in depth. And the grammar and mechanics in this instance would be just as important as the argumentation and the content. You know, the journal's much more informal, so basically I'm not reading for grammar or mechanics, just for content. And that's why I'm grading the journals on a checkmark system rather than on a letter scale. Though everybody has the option of rewriting that first paper for a higher grade if you feel some anxiety about the first paper. And as you're thinking about some of these upcoming writing assignments, I wanted to move us forward to our next genre, or basically category of literature. We began with short story, and now we're moving forward to drama, which is also sometimes known as play acting. And drama is in some ways similar to short story in relation to the ways that we would go about analyzing it, but it also is different, because ultimately dramas are meant to be performed. So there's an additional layer of interpretation here based on the actor and also based on the director, because the director will ultimately direct the actor and the actor's performance. So you can think of dramas as basically two different things: the ones that we actually see performed and then the ones that we actually spend our time reading. And I wanted us to have a combination of the two with the 3 dramas that we're going to be reading this semester, beginning with Oedipus the King and then moving forward to Midsummer Night's Dream and then ultimately ending with Raisin in the Sun. So in terms of reading drama, a couple of points in terms of how it is different from short story. Dramas will have stage directions. Usually they will be in italics. The stage directions are very important because this gives us a sense of how the author of the drama wanted that particular drama to be performed on stage. So definitely take time to read the stage directions and to try to visualize. As well, dramas are dialogue driven. So what you've got are a series of characters giving dialogue. You need to spend some time, if you're reading a drama, reading the character names and trying to visualize their appearances so that you can differentiate them one from another. Obviously, this would be much easier if you were watching the drama perform live on stage, because you would have different actors with different appearances and different wardrobe and so forth. So it would be much easier for you to distinguish between them. So you're going to need to slow down a little bit when you're reading to actually read the names of who is speaking that particular piece of dialogue and to try to visualize that particular character. And in terms of dramas, probably our most common experience with experiencing a drama is probably at home. And that would be through television. Though if you've ever been fortunate enough to see a drama live, you know how incredibly electric that kind of experience can be. And it really can't be duplicated on film. It's very similar to watching a concert live, if you've ever seen a musical concert live. And obviously it won't be as polished as a recording, but it's much more visceral, and it also is much more unpredictable. And obviously the actors are playing off of the audience, and the audience are influencing the actors. So in that respect, we aren't necessarily going to be able to duplicate what we would see in a live performance because we're watching film performances. But again, television is probably one of our major ways that we consume dramatic vehicles through the comfort of our home. And in fact, this is how our textbook talks about formulaic drama. If you remember, we had talked about this at the beginning of the semester when we talked about formula fiction. And we talked about things like romance novels, though we could have talked about other genres, for instance, horror, for instance. But what we talked about was basically a Harlequin romance, and how that didn't have the depth or the level of complexity of the kind of literature that we would be focusing on in the literature section. And the textbook does something similar by introducing us to a television drama that, again, probably written primarily for profit and for entertainment, though that's not to say that it can't also be clever or also have some literary merit associated with it, depending on the television show. The television show that they selected was from the heyday of television, the 1990s. This was the pre-internet, or at least the expansion of the internet in the way that we know it now. A television show by the name of Seinfeld that you might be familiar with. And they illustrate the difference between actually reading as opposed to watching a dramatic performance. And this is on page 1110. And I'm just going to read a few lines here from Act 2, Scene G. This is the interior of NBC's President's Office Day. And the stage directions are, the mood is jovial. Stu Shermack is there, along with Susan Ross, Jay Crespi, and Russell Dalrymple, the head of the network. And Stu says to Jerry, the bit I really like was where the parakeet flew into the mirror. Now that's funny. And George says, the parakeet in the mirror? That's a good one, Stu. Jerry says, yeah, it's one of my favorites. And Russell says, what about you, George? Have you written anything we might know? And George says, well, possibly. I wrote an off-Broadway show, La Cocina. Actually, it was an off-Broadway. It was a comedy about a Mexican chef. And the dialogue continues. My reading it's fairly dull and flat compared to actually seeing it performed by the actors. And you can see in the notes below that I've got a link where you can watch that brief little scene. And obviously the actors make it come alive. Now, if you have familiarity with the television show Seinfeld, then you are at an advantage in terms of reading the selection in the text and watching it being performed. If you have had the advantage of watching this actual episode called The Pitch, then you are even at more of an advantage. If it turns out that you have no familiarity with the show Seinfeld, then you're going to be at a disadvantage in terms of reading and also watching production. And it's the same thing with all of the dramas that we are exposed to in this unit, and just dramas in general. If you have some familiarity with the drama, then you've got some advantages, just like if you had some familiarity with a short story. And ideally, you would read a drama multiple times and also watch multiple performances, because each performance is unique and individual, depending on the director and the actor and just that particular moment in time. But obviously, life is not ideal, and because dramas are much longer than short stories, you may not necessarily have the leisure or the flexibility to be able to read a drama more than once. But the idea is that each time you see a production or you read a drama, you should be able to develop greater appreciation and understanding for it. But I wanted to use that example of Seinfeld as a way to illustrate the difference between just reading, which is a much inferior experience, to actually watching a production. And if we're watching a drama that is a piece of literature that's well written, it'll have the depth and complexity that we've become accustomed to with short story, so that when we read it, the experience will be just as rich as actually watching it be performed. And they actually give you an example of a drama. It's a one-act drama, which is very short. And they use that as an example of how we could go reading drama. And this particular example, I think, illustrates the importance of focusing on stage direction and focusing on character. And the actual drama itself is entitled Trifles, which means things that are not very important. And if you were to read this drama in its entirety, it just happens to be the story of a murder. And basically, the law enforcement, which arrives along with their wives. So they're trying to solve the mystery of this domestic dispute, or what could be a domestic dispute, the murder of John Wright. And it turns out the men are unable to solve the mystery, but the women, by looking at these seemingly minor details that would seem to be trifles, are able to piece together what happened and why it happened. And basically, it comes down to a marriage that was basically filled with difficulty. And the wife finally snapped after her husband had killed her beloved pet, and she killed him. And after they came to the conclusion of what had happened, then the women had a decision to make. Were they going to tell their partners, the law enforcement agencies, what had happened, or would they keep it to themselves because they understood that the woman had been misused and abused throughout her marriage, and they decided to keep it to themselves. So that's basically the plot. But what's more important for our purposes in terms of learning how to read drama, and this is on page 1080, notice we're given the list of characters at the beginning. George Henderson is a county attorney, and you should try to visualize what he would look like. And Henry Peters is a sheriff, and you should try to visualize what he would look like, and that would be different from the county attorney and all of the other characters as well. And the stage directions: the kitchen in the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, a gloomy kitchen and left without being put in order. Unwashed pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table, other signs of incompleted work. At the rear, the outer door opens and the sheriff comes in, followed by the county attorney and Hale. The sheriff and Hale are men in middle life. The county attorney is a young man. And now that you've read that, you might have to rethink the visualization that you made for these characters. And of course, it goes on after that. So think about the idea of investing and trying to visualize, particularly if you're reading before you've actually watched a production of the performance of that drama. As I indicated, we're going to begin with the drama that is very important historically, Oedipus the King. And you can see in the notes below, I've included a web link for that drama if it turns out that you don't have access to the textbook. And in terms of thinking about the elements that you are likely to find in drama, though you may not necessarily find all of them in all dramas, and since Oedipus the King is in the early days of drama, you're less likely to find all of these. Dramas are basically divided into acts. Those are the main divisions in a play. And we use the term simultaneously, a play or a drama. And scenes are divisions within acts. Usually they indicate a change of location or the introduction or the exit of a character. And oftentimes dramas have not just one plot, but subplots. These are secondary actions to the main plot. And again, we have that liberty because of the length of a drama in a way that we don't necessarily see length in short story. Again, the stage directions are the playwright's instructions to the actors. And the pyramid structure of a drama is basically, think about a pyramid, and when you start at the bottom of one side of the pyramid, let's say the left, you've got some rising action until you get to the top of the pyramid, the pinnacle. That would be the height of conflict. And then you've got a descent from the top of the pyramid all the way down to the other end of the pyramid. In fact, when we get to Shakespeare, we'll talk about how it's predictable when these events occur. And in some ways, you could say that pyramid structure is something that we see in all pieces of literature, that literature builds to some sort of height or conflict, and then usually there's some sort of a descent. And the textbook provides us with questions to think about when we are reading drama, much like the textbook provided us with questions to think about when we're reading short story. Not that you should ask yourself all of these questions necessarily, but you can keep them in the back of your mind. These are things to consider as you're reading, or ultimately, eventually writing about drama, because eventually you'll have to do a journal about drama, much like you're doing a journal on short story. Eventually you'll write a paper on drama, much like you're writing a paper on short story. So some of these questions, and some of them will sound familiar because these are similar sorts of questions that you asked yourself for a short story. And again, this is on page 1115. Did you enjoy the play? Why or why not? Or what is the significance of the title? Or what information do the stage directions provide about the characters? How is the exposition or background information presented? In what ways is the setting important? Are foreshadowings used to suggest what's to come? What is the major conflict the protagonist faces? Again, many of these questions are very similar to sorts of questions you would have been asking yourself in a short story. Are one or more subplots used? Again, that might be different than what you would see in a short story. Does the author use a pyramidal plot structure of rising action, climax, and falling action? Who's the protagonist and who or what is the antagonist? Or on page 1116, question 11, by what means does the playwright reveal the characters? How do their names or physical qualities or actions or words convey their personalities? Or 12, what is the purpose of the minor characters? Or 13, do all of the characters use the same kind of language? And if not, why not? Is some more formal, some more informal? 14, does your response to the characters change over the course of the play? And if so, why? 15, are there words or images repeated in the play that take on special significance and meanings? 16, how does the playwright's use of language contribute to the tone of the play? 17, are symbols used in the play? 18, are there unfamiliar theatrical conventions used that present problems in understanding the play? That's going to be very important with Oedipus the King. Are there any question 19, is the theme stated directly or is it developed implicitly? And if so, what is that theme? 20, how does the play reflect the values of the society in which it was written? 21, how does the play reflect or challenge our own values? 22, is there some sort of recording of the film that you can watch? Again, I shared with you I'm planning on showing recordings of all three of the dramas that we are reading. 23 is a particularly interesting question. How would you produce the play on stage? Consider scenery, costumes, casting, characterizations. If you were the director, how would you go about producing this play? 24, is there a particular critical approach that seems especially appropriate for this play? 25, how might biographical information about the author help you to understand the play? 26, how might historical information about the play provide a useful context? 27, to what extent do your experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions inform your interpretation? 28, what kinds of evidence from the play are you focusing on to support your interpretation? Does your interpretation leave out any important elements that might be undercut or qualify your interpretation? And 29, given there are a variety of ways to interpret the play, which one seems to be the most useful to you and why? We even have a sample paper on page 1117 where somebody is beginning to write about that play that I was referencing earlier, Trifles. So that said, the play that we're going to be focusing on happens to be Oedipus the King, written by Sophocles. So this is the 400s BC in Athens, Greece. So obviously we are reading a translation. You're not expected to be fluent in the Greek, and I certainly am not. And Sophocles, the author, was a statesman. He was a general. He was also a dramatist. So he wore many hats. And while there are over 120 play fragments of the time, only a handful remain intact. And Oedipus is part of a 3-play cycle, actually. We are reading only the first play of the 3 plays in the trilogy, Oedipus the King, followed by Antigone, which I believe might be included in your textbook, and finally Oedipus at Colonus. Antigone happens to be the continuation of the story of Oedipus the King, told from the perspective of his adult children, and Oedipus at Colonus is a return back to Oedipus the King himself as an old man. And again, you need to read all 3 stories to understand the true saga, but the first story stands alone. All of the plays can stand alone, and we are focusing on the first, Oedipus the King. Part of the reason why is because it's considered to be so historically important, this play, because it helped to establish the idea and definition and criteria for what we think of in terms of tragedy. And when we think of tragedy, we oftentimes think of major playwrights like Shakespeare, and usually the plays that come to mind are things like Hamlet, Macbeth, and Othello. And Shakespeare was well aware of the criteria that had been established with Oedipus the King and would follow that criteria and also break from that criteria, not because he didn't know how to follow the criteria, but because he wanted to make some sort of artistic statement by breaking the criteria. So some of the ways that Sophocles was able to distinguish himself as moving the dramatic vehicle forward was by adding a third actor on stage. Up until that point, there had just been two actors on stage, because it could lead to confusion of the audience to differentiate the actors. It would have been performed in a Greek amphitheater. If you've ever seen a picture of a Greek amphitheater, it's a large structure that basically is carved out of the stone with seats in it that could seat thousands. You can think about something like a stadium. They were supposed to be marvels in architecture and acoustics, so that would help take care of sound. But that said, regardless of how sophisticated it was, obviously it's going to be difficult to see and to hear, which is why we get some rather unusual theatrical conventions at the time, because they didn't have the modern technology that we've become accustomed to today. So think about the idea of adding a third actor on stage. This would be much easier to do if you had actors who were wearing these large masks, so you could differentiate one actor from another, especially if you were in what I call the nosebleed seats, so to speak. And it's thought that those masks also had amplification devices within them, so that would help to project volume. There was also, in terms of costuming, the actors would wear large padded costumes, so they were more visible on stage. And also they would probably wear stilted shoes, again, to make them appear larger than life. And we would also have a convention known as the chorus. And the chorus would basically represent the townspeople, or they could also serve as narrator, because basically the chorus would comment on the action as well as react to the action. And the chorus would be a group of people who would chant all their lines in unison. And part that would help to project their volume, and also that could serve as a kind of soundtrack as well if they were chanting. So Sophocles actually reduced the role of the chorus, which again could serve as the townspeople reacting, but it could also serve as a kind of narrator commenting. Think about the difficulty of being able to have narration, something we take for granted in a short story, because we can read about what a character is thinking. And again, you can't necessarily do that in something that's dialogue focused and the way that we expect drama to be. So we've got to think about an alternative for that. So the idea behind drama is that they were supported by government because this was a religious festival, and it was a festival specifically to one of the gods, Dionysus, the god of wine and fertility. Notice that this is a culture of gods. This culture is very different than our contemporary culture. And also it was thought to help reinforce community values, that there would be educational reasons, as well as celebratory reasons for having a dramatic performance. And again, the Greek amphitheater that I was talking about, it could seat over 14,000 people, to give you a sense of the kind of size of the seats built into the hillside rocks. And one of the conventions of the time was known as Deus Ex Machina, which meant God from the machine. And what that basically meant was a kind of mechanical stage device that would be used to perhaps lower a character onto stage, or perhaps raise a character from stage. For instance, if you wanted a character to descend or ascend from the heavens, I guess it would be comparable to or it could be seen as comparable to the early days of special effects. What the term has come to mean now, Deus Ex Machina, is any artificial means used in a piece of writing in order to be able to give a quick resolution. So for instance, at the ending of a story, finding out that the character is woken up by a dream and everything we just read was a dream, that would be considered Deus Ex Machina, a very artificial way, a mechanical way of sort of ending a performance. The wardrobes, as I had indicated, not in addition to these large masks and the padded costumes and the platform shoes, you've also got the chorus who would be chanting and commenting on and responding to the action. So it's going to be very different, this kind of performance, than what we would expect in contemporary times. Again, because of the many limitations that theaters had during the time. Some of the elements you could expect in Greek drama were things like examination of hubris, which meant excessive pride. Definitely we will see that in Oedipus the King, and the consequences of having excessive pride. What an audience should feel would be pity and fear. And the idea is helped established by someone whose name you might be familiar with, Aristotle. And I had you do a brief reading called On Tragic Character on page 1165 from Aristotle, who is probably best known for his philosophy, but he was also one of the early literary critics, I suppose you could think of. And he basically defined what tragedy was and indicated that Oedipus the King was one of the finest examples of tragedy. That a tragedy should be complex. Much like we were talking about in the short story section, all literature should have a certain level of complexity to it so that it's got value for us as readers. It should be about terrible and piteous events because tragedies are supposed to be, well, tragic. Though certainly we can have dramas that don't necessarily have to have tragedy as their primary force. So you could think about something like our next drama, Midsummer Night's Dream. It is a drama, but it's dealing with comedic and lighthearted issues, as we will discuss when we get to that particular section. And Aristotle also talked about how tragedies would have a tragic hero. This would be the main character who would be a great man, above and beyond the ordinary, somebody much better than any of us, somebody that we could admire. And this person would experience a downfall. And the downfall would result in part because of that character's flaw, or flaws is probably more accurate. So they're responsible in some way. So in the ways in which they're responsible, that's the learning or instructional vehicle for us, not to duplicate those actions. Hubris, again, oftentimes being one of the main flaws, but not necessarily the only flaw. However, there are also outside forces to play. And there are lots of different ways that you can think of outside forces. Some people call them fate. Some people call them luck. Some people call them destiny. But things that you cannot control. So this is very important because ultimately we as audience are supposed to feel pity and fear. We feel pity for this character because this is a good man above and beyond the ordinary. We also fear because if this good man could experience this kind of downfall, somebody who's much better than we are, then we can experience a similar or worse downfall. So that should be the audience response. And that ultimately, because this is a good individual, they come to accept responsibility, at least for the part that they play in their descent. But again, not all of the descent is their fault. There is some sort of outside force, be it destiny or luck or fate, whatever language you want to use. And the characters should be as necessary and probable as possible. In other words, you want to try to be as realistic as possible within the confines of a drama. So that said, in our contemporary times, when we're reading something like Oedipus the King, these characters may not seem particularly realistic. But the idea is that based on, again, the plot, they're as realistic as possible. So certainly some of the things that Aristotle had talked about was that you should try to have a unity of time and place, meaning that if a play takes place over approximately 2 hours, then the action within the play should take place over 2 hours, not years or decades, because obviously that is too unrealistic. And we see that in Oedipus the King, that it basically happens in real time over the course of how long it would take for us to watch the play, though we are told background information by being filled in from other characters about things that happened in the past. Unity of time and also unity of place. Once you've begun a location, and obviously the audience has to suspend disbelief because they're well aware that we are not at that location, we're watching a stage in a theater. But once you've accepted that this stage and this theater is supposed to represent a locale, let's say Greece, then you should stay within that locale. You shouldn't have the story move from one geographic region to another, because obviously we're not moving from one geographic location to another as audience. That would be considered to be too unrealistic. And you might be familiar with Oedipus the King if you are familiar with psychology, and particularly Sigmund Freud, who was very well read. Sigmund Freud considered to be the father of psychology. And what Sigmund Freud did is that he oftentimes took literary figures and adapted them in order to label some of his famous psychological theories. So you might have heard of the Oedipal complex, which is very loosely based on Oedipus the King. And the Oedipal complex, according to Freud, was that from his perspective, all boys saw their fathers as a sexual competition for the attention of their mothers. And there's another complex called the Electra complex, also loosely taken from literature, saying that the same thing happened with girls, that girls would see their mothers as some kind of sexual competition for their father's attention. And if you're studying Freud, then you know that he's pretty much fallen out of favor in terms of many of his theories, which were often sexually oriented. Nevertheless, since he was the first to sort of standardize and formalize the discipline of psychology, he's considered the father of psychology. And he very loosely based his theory on Oedipus the King. And this is an important point here, is that the audience members watching this play would already know the plot. So if you think about the limitations of the theater, you didn't necessarily have to watch a performance in order to understand the action, because you knew the action ahead of time. So that if it turns out that you couldn't see well or you couldn't hear well or whatever the case may happen to be, you still knew what was happening and unfolding. So it's important that we know the plot before we begin reading Oedipus the King, much like the audience would know about the plot before Oedipus the King. And basically, the plot of Oedipus the King, it begins in media res, which means in the middle. So the play actually begins when we've got Oedipus as the king of the community who is trying to find out an answer to a mystery. His community is being ravaged by plague, and he wants to try to understand what sin have they committed to incur the wrath of the gods and the plague upon them. So he sends out all kinds of individuals to consult with oracles, which was common at the time, to try to find out the truth. And the same answer keeps coming back, that basically Oedipus himself is responsible. And he denies it. He becomes angry and irate. He accuses individuals of conspiring against him, trying to steal his throne. And then ultimately, as the play unfolds, the truth begins to be revealed. This is where we're told a lot of backstory. And ultimately, we find out that Oedipus indeed is responsible for the plague. So how did this all happen? As we get pieces of the backstory, we find out that Oedipus's birth parents, after they had their baby Oedipus, they went to an oracle, which was common at the time, to hear about this baby's future. And the oracle said that this baby would have a horrific future. Eventually, it would grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. And the parents are horrified that this is the fate for their child. So they decide to take matters into their own hands and have their baby killed so that this doesn't come to fruition. And they give the baby to a servant to kill. Now, the servant takes pity on the child, and instead of killing the child, he ends up abandoning the child on a mountaintop. And it turns out that child happens to be discovered by another servant from another kingdom. And that servant brings the child to that kingdom. And it turns out that the king and queen, who are childless, end up raising that baby as their own. And they never let the child know that he is not their biological child. Eventually, that child grows up and becomes the man Oedipus, and he consults an oracle, which was common at the time, to try to get a sense of what his destiny and future would be. And the oracle tells him, well, you have a horrible future, because one day you will kill your father and marry your mother. And Oedipus, being a good man, is horrified, and he decides he needs to take matters into his own hands and try to stop this horrific thing from happening. So his decision is to leave home and to try to put as much physical distance between himself and his parents to protect them. And of course, he does not realize that the people he is trying to get physical distance from are not his biological parents. They are his adopted parents. And it turns out along his travels, at one point he's at a crossroads, and this is a literal and a figurative crossroads, and someone is blocking his way. And he becomes so irate with anger, one of Oedipus's flaws, that someone would block his way, that he ends up slaying everyone in that chariot. And it just so turns out that one of the people in that chariot was his biological father. And I once had a student say something very clever about this, that perhaps it was one of the earliest literary examples of road rage, and I couldn't disagree. At any rate, so Oedipus continues his travels, and he comes across a kingdom that's being ravaged by plague through this horrific monster called the Sphinx. And basically, the Sphinx is going to continue enacting the plague on the community until its riddle is solved. And there's an old literary tradition here of basically monsters having riddles that needed to be solved. No one was smart enough to solve the riddle. And the riddle was, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oedipus was the only one who was smart enough to answer this riddle. The answer is man. because as a baby, you crawl or you walk on 4 legs. As an adult, you walk on 2 legs, you walk upright. And when you are elderly, you walk on 3 legs, your both legs, and of course, your cane. So Oedipus, it turns out, saves the community, and the community is overjoyed. And it just so turns out that their king had recently been murdered. So this means that they could offer Oedipus the kingdom in reward for his solving the riddle. And that also means that he would marry the recently widowed queen. And as you've probably already figured out, the recently widowed queen also happens to be Oedipus's biological mother. Not that he knew that. And they basically end up living almost happily ever after and having children of their own until, and then this is the beginning of the play Oedipus the King. Their community begins to be ravaged by plague, and Oedipus, as a man, the ruler, needs to try to find the answer of why it is that they've angered the gods. And the response is that it's Oedipus himself who's angered the gods by committing incest with his mother and killing his father. So his mother, when she figures it out, and basically everybody figures it out before Oedipus, which is quite interesting because Oedipus has established himself as being rather bright, and he doesn't see what's so obvious right in front of him, as we will discuss. When she figures it out, she encourages Oedipus to stop digging for the truth because she's more concerned with her own welfare of her biological, or her nuclear, I should say, family, rather than with the community. And Oedipus continues on because, again, he's a good man, and of course he could never imagine the horrors that will be revealed. His wife / mother, whose name is Jocasta, is so horrified by it all that she runs off and she commits suicide. And then Oedipus finds her body eventually and takes the brooches that she's wearing off of her dress and gouges out his eyes. And one of the reasons why is because he's been blind throughout the entire play, even though he has vision. But he never had insight. So vision and blindness is a major theme in the play, especially because one of the individuals that Oedipus consults with in terms of the oracle happens to be a blind prophet. In other words, the prophet cannot see, Tiresias is his name, but he has insight. So by the ending of the play, Oedipus has accepted responsibility the way a good tragic hero should, by basically punishing himself by gouging out his eyes and ultimately exiling himself from the community. Jocasta never accepts that responsibility. And then that's the difference between her and Oedipus and why Oedipus is considered to be a great man. And then ultimately, it turns out that Oedipus's brother-in-law, Creon, takes over the kingdom. Some more irony here because Creon was one of the individuals Oedipus had sent to the oracle. And when Creon comes back to report that the oracle says that Oedipus is responsible for the plague, Oedipus basically accuses Creon of trying to steal the kingdom for himself. And Creon says, I have no interest in this. I'm quite content with the position I have. I'm part of royalty, so I have lots of privilege, but I don't have the responsibility of king. But at the ending of the play, it turns out that Creon is the one who's going to be taking over as king. And Oedipus basically exiles himself and becomes much like his own riddle, because even though he's not elderly, he does need to have a walking stick because he's blind as he goes off on 3 legs. And that's the play Oedipus the King. And then the play continues with Antigone, as I was indicating, the second play in the trilogy. This is the story of one of Oedipus's children as an adult, and also the story of Creon, who's aged by this point. And ironically, Creon has a very different character in this play. In this second play, he's much like the way Oedipus is in the first play, filled with arrogance and quick temper. Perhaps a commentary about how the position of leadership and rule can change an individual. And then finally, the last play in the trilogy is Oedipus at Colonus, which is the story of Oedipus, who's been wandering blind in exile for years. Has he basically earned the forgiveness of the gods? So those are the 3 plays, but we're just focusing on one. But now you have a sense of the plot of Oedipus the King. And obviously, going back to Freud, Freud's theory was very different than the plot of Oedipus. So it's very loosely based, because obviously in Oedipus the King, Oedipus never directly wanted to kill his father and marry his mother. But Freud argued that from a subconscious perspective, that's exactly what happens within families. Again, his theories have been very discredited in many respects, but that's where the Oedipal complex comes from. So these are just some of the elements that I wanted you to consider in terms of dramas and Oedipus the King in particular, as you're beginning to think about writing for your first paper. Again, due on the 26th, 11:59 p.m. on Short Story and One Element, as I work through your journals and get those back to you so that you could utilize them for your paper. And for today's attendance question, and this will be due on the 15th of October at 10 a.m. And again, if you need an extension, please let me know. I wanted you to think about that paper. Paper number 1, what story are you considering writing your first paper about and why? What story out of the short story unit are you considering devoting your first paper to and why? And then next class, we can continue on talking a little bit about papers as well as specifically Oedipus the King. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.